Okay, so I'll just start my introduction again by saying, for me, my name is Peggy Kurtz. Welcome to this program, which is program presented by Rockland Sierra Club and WAR. And I'm sorry, WAR is, let me just make sure I read it correctly, stands for Religious Orders Along the River. And Sister Carol will be speaking about that connection a little bit more in a few minutes. Um, for me, this is one in a series of programs I hoped that we can do this year. I also should say Rockland Sierra Club is part of the larger group, which is Lower Hudson Group of Sierra Club, which also meets monthly. This is one in a series of programs I hope to do this year on the very serious issue of the crisis of biodiversity and species extinctions. Very serious crisis that unfortunately not that many people are aware of. As environmentalists, we spend a great deal of time fighting the wrong things, fossil fuel pipelines and desalination proposals, etc. But it's also important to put out our vision for a better way. And that's what this program is all about. The movement for the rights of nature is a way to legally protect ecosystems. But I see it also as a cultural shift, to see nature not just as resources that human beings can use, but rather as having an inherent right not only to be, but also to thrive. Beloved environmental writer Aldo Leopold wrote in 1927 in a beautiful little essay that's called, what's it called again? It's called the environmental ethic, the land ethic it's called, about an evolution in our ethics over time and the necessity to expand our moral circle beyond human beings to what he called land, meaning land, animals, and plants. And he wrote that that ethic depends on our seeing ourselves as part of a larger community that includes what he called land, and that implies respect for the integrity of that community, for itself, and an obligation on our part to help it thrive. Today, he wrote that essay in 1927. Today, almost 100 years later, that evolution in ethics, that essay is so prescient. And that evolution in ethics is needed more urgently than ever. And that's why I think this program is so important. The rights of nature is a way of helping us shift our perspective in a way that is so urgently needed. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Sister Carol. Sister Carol is a member of the Sisters of Charity of New York, and she is also their director of the Office of Peace, Justice, and Integrity of Creation, and a member of WAR, which is Religious Orders Along the River. Sister Carol?
Thanks. Thank you, Peggy. And it's really great. I just want to thank Peggy and Rockland Group for letting us co-sponsor this conversation with Tish, with you. So I did think it would be helpful if I just say a few words about ROAR, and just a slight correction is religious organizations. Okay, religious organizations.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. So ROAR is actually going to celebrate its 30th anniversary in 2 years. It's hard to believe that. And we're a network of about 12 religious congregations of vowed men and women who believe that we share kinship with all creation, and that humans, the water, the air, the land, and our common home, Earth, form a single sacred community. So I'm giving you some background on this so that it might give you an idea of how we got involved with this rights of nature movement. So Pope Francis in 2015 wrote this Laudato Si letter to all peoples on the earth, and he reaffirmed what we had been working on since our very beginning in 1996, that we are part of nature, not separate from it. And several years ago, John Lipscomb, who is patrol boat and advocate for Riverkeeper, he asked ROAR members to see, and I have "see" in quotes here, because he asked us to see in a new way the Hudson River from the Rights of Nature movement. And as we learned more about this, our perspective did shift. While we continue to work with our environmental colleagues and you, all right, many of whom are on this Zoom, on environmental injustice and address issues such as PCBs, closure of Indian Point, PFASs, and no new fossil fuel infrastructure, we knew we needed to practice integral ecology. That's a term that's become much more used since the encyclical came out. And it's a way of thinking, doing, and being that sees everything as connected and interrelated. So as we address issues now as ROAR members, we try to see the river's perspective, and even more broadly, from an ecosystem perspective, while we see ourselves, where we see ourselves as part of a larger whole. So I'd like to mention here Laudato Si, just a few phrases from Laudato, one longer paragraph from Laudato Si, and 3 from Laudate Deum, which is a more recent letter from the Pope that was came out in October. And he actually wrote that letter because he's really concerned people are not responding to the climate crises. And he was very concerned about the expectations and what was going to happen in COP28 in Dubai. So I just highlight this for you because this gives you an idea of why ROAR is kind of working out of this philosophy, out of this viewpoint and perspective. What is being asked of us is nothing other than a certain responsibility for the legacy we will leave behind once we pass from this world. What is the legacy that we will leave behind? Human beings must be recognized as part of nature. Human life, intelligence, and freedom are elements of the nature that enriches our planet, part of its internal working and its equilibrium. And that causes us to challenge ourselves. How are we using our life, our intelligence, our freedom for the good of the whole? We need to rethink, among other things, the question of human power, its meaning and its limits. And there's a lot on human power and how it's used in that Laudate Deum letter. But I'm going to end with this from Laudato Si. Nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. Recognizing the reasons why a given area is polluted requires a study of the workings of society, its economy, its behavior patterns, and the ways it grasps reality. That could, we could spend a long time saying, what does that mean to us? But I offer this to say, this is why we really, as ROAR, have said we want to really spend some time learning about how the rights of nature can impact our love of the Hudson, our bio region, our system, ecosystem here. And that's how we came to know Tish O'Dell. And so I have the honor of introducing you, Tish. So we're going to shift now because this is really about Tish sharing her expertise. So Tish is the consulting director at CELDF, Community Education Legal Defense Fund. And I'm going to give you some highlights that I got from the website. Do that first to give you a flavor of her rich experiences. She's a CELDF Democracy School lecturer and a founding member and current board member of the Ohio Community Rights Network. For 10 years now, she has been involved in community rights and rights of nature work, starting in her own community at Broadview Heights, Ohio, which led to the adoption of Ohio's first Home Rule Charter Amendment, creating a community bill of rights, banning fracking, and recognizing rights of nature. She's worked with dozens of Ohio communities on anti-fracking, anti-pipeline, right to a livable climate, fair and free elections, and water privatization issues. And she works with communities all over the country and internationally, and most recently assisted the people of Toledo with their effort to pass the historic Lake Erie Bill of Rights, the first law on United States settler colonial land to recognize the rights of a specific ecosystem. And these above facts tell us about Tish's professional work. What they don't convey is Tish's gift of bringing people together, people who have a passion and commitment to care for each other and the land on which they live. Tish has a vision of a healthy, sustainable, life-giving ecosystem of which we are a part. Her perseverance, openness, and insights have helped to bring people together to work towards that vision. And I saw this happen when I was privileged at her invitation to join in October a Truth, Reckoning, and Right Relationship Conference. That was part one. And just a few weeks ago, she had part two, which I wasn't able to attend, but I heard it was very successful. So Tish, we welcome you and look forward to hearing your insights and your wisdom. Thanks a lot, Tish.
Oh my gosh. Between you and Peggy, I'm like, I feel like so hopeful because I'm like, I feel like you've got it. You summed it up beautifully. I don't even have to talk. You guys are great. And I can tell you just a few years ago, people would not have like introduced it that way, rights of nature. And so to me, I mean, I'm in this all the time. And I can tell you that this is really awe-inspiring to me because it means that there's an evolution taking place already, and that's what's so awesome about all of this, that you've started evolving in your thinking. And so it's working. The plants the seeds we planted are starting to sprout. So that's great. I love, that term integral ecology and that idea that we're part of nature, not separated from it. And that we need to think about issues and projects from the river's perspective. I can tell you no one would have said that probably even a year or a year and a half ago in an introduction. So thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Again, that perspective, it's not what we're taught or raised to think about, let alone believe in. And I too had to go through my own evolution in my own thinking to get to this place where I am today. So I thought really quickly, I know we've been talking about with Indigenous people and others that people learn a lot through storytelling. And so I thought I would just tell the quick short story of who I am and how I evolved to be this rights of nature advocate, and according to Carol, some expert. And maybe, some of this will resonate with you and your story and your journey as well. But I was born and raised in the Cleveland area. My dad also, he had immigrant parents and he was raised in the Cleveland area. And then I raised my son in the same community I was raised in. And the only reason I say that is because I have a real connection to place. And I think that's really important. And it's a part of, I think, this evolution that has to happen, because I started thinking about it before doing traditional environmental activism. We want to get people engaged and we want to seem like we get people angry about what's happening and getting them in the streets. And then it dawned on me, well, if people don't feel that sense of connection to nature and to the place, how do we expect them to get that emotional and want to get into the streets or take risks or do what they have to do in order to protect it? In 2010, what happened, it was life-altering for me. I attended a council meeting and there was new people moving in the community, and it was urban drilling and fracking. And my community is very residential, but they were doing this in people's backyards and neighborhoods. They were doing it next to schools, next to churches, next to City Hall. So I did what most people do. I started educating myself on what this was. I didn't have a lot of information on the process. And of course, the more I researched, the more I opposed it. But I went to first my local electeds and said, here's what I've learned. Help us stop this. And of course, they said, no, we can't help you. And they said, go to the state elected. So went to the state electeds. They said, go to the EPA. So then I went to the EPA and they said, oh no, you got to go to the health department. So then we realized, we were getting the runaround here. I even went to Sherrod Brown, who is our federal elected representative, but no one at all would help. They all just said the same kind of things. They all muttered under their breath, well, it's bringing jobs. Jobs are what's important. That's the most important thing. So then what I did in 2011, I ran for mayor because I figured I would stop it myself, believing in this, great democracy we have, and I'll fix it. Well, I lost the election, but I learned a whole lot, and I had walked all the neighborhoods. And so I learned and met a lot of community members that I didn't know and talked to all these people, and we formed bonds, building community. So in 2012, I worked with CELDF because during my mayoral race, that's when I learned about CELDF. I didn't know what they were, that they were a nonprofit public interest law firm. And they helped us draft this law for our community, which not only would prohibit oil and gas drilling, but it had the first rights of nature language in it. And that's how I became aware of rights of nature for the state of Ohio. Put it on a ballot and the people passed it, and we thought, yay, we won. But then in 2013, 2 drillers sued the city to have the law overturned because they found it very threatening. At that point, CELDF helped us, the residents. We filed a class action lawsuit against the state, against the governor, against the EPA, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, for violating our rights to clean air, water, and soil. And also that year, I was sued for $1 million for speaking out against a de-icer that contained high levels of radiation. And all through all this, I wasn't making the connection yet that what we do to nature, we do to ourselves. I still believed, in the system that I was taught about, regulating the harms, and that somehow, the laws will protect everything. But it was around that time that I heard an indigenous speaker in Oberlin, his name is Sundance. And he said to the group at that time, he said, what you do to me, you do to yourselves. And honestly, at that time in 2013, I didn't understand exactly what he meant. I mean, I do now, obviously, and thankfully we've become good friends and he's continued to share with me, but I didn't. In 2013, I was hired as an organizer, part-time organizer by CELDF. And as Carol said, I spent the next several years working with other communities. We had over 40 attempts in Ohio to put rights of nature laws on the ballot across the state. And what I learned then firsthand was the more pressure the people put on the system to change it by proposing all these laws, is that the system was going to push back and get more aggressive to stop it. Then in 2019, we'll jump ahead, that the Lake Erie Bill of Rights was put on a ballot. And that was a fight all in itself. That's a different story for a different time. But when it went on the ballot and it passed, it got a ton of media attention. I mean, we didn't expect any of this. We had the Daily Show come and they did a segment. Le Monde from France covered it. The UK, a paper in Italy, India. It became a clue on Jeopardy, the game show. And locally, though, we weren't getting all that much coverage, but it was getting all this national and international attention. Well, what happened is just 12 hours after it passed on the ballot, a federal lawsuit was filed to have it overturned. So that quickly. Our state, within 2 months, they inserted sneakily into our budget bill a preemption language, which we found out later was written by the Ohio Chamber of Commerce, and it closed the courts to rights of nature. And it said no other community in Ohio, the people could represent nature in a court in Ohio. So all this is happening and it seems really horrible and awful, right? Like, this is bad, this isn't gonna work. And at the same time, that same year, 2019, I got an email from an art museum in Cleveland, the Contemporary Museum of Art. And they said this artist, this LA-based activist artist who's internationally known, is fascinated with rights of nature and wants to cover the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. And so I was like, my first reaction at the time was, what in the hell does art have to do with law? We work for a law firm, and what does this have to do with art? So again, still not connecting and still evolving this whole time. Then in 2020 is when the Lake Erie Bill of Rights actually went to federal court. And it was the first time ever in this country that the rights of an ecosystem were argued in federal court for over 45 minutes. Now, the judge ruled on the wrong side, of course. He ruled on the side of the big corporate entity and not on the side of Lake Erie. And he was on the wrong side of history, which I think, you know, so many of the judges that we know from history, when we review them later, you know, decades later, it's like we know they're on the wrong side of history. But even though this court and this judge overturned the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, you know, opting in favor of the corporate rights, a New York state legislator, Patrick Burke, contacted CELDF. And he said, you know what? I've been following the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, but I don't think that's enough anymore. Now I think because all the Great Lakes are connected and interconnected, it's not enough to protect one lake. We need to protect them all. I was like, wow. He's like, can you help us draft a Great Lakes Bill of Rights? So, you know, my lesson, I guess, here, and that I learned and hoping I'm sharing with all of you, is that even though this court ruled against rights of nature and Lake Erie, we still had this artist who was fascinated, wanted to create a whole exhibit around it. We had a New York legislator, state legislator, who wanted to introduce a bill about it. And we also had another Ohio community, Cincinnati, that even though they knew all this stuff, they still wanted us to help them draft an Ohio River Bill of Rights. So I could really feel like this shift happening. And of course, in 2020, then of course, COVID shut down the museum. So we had another obstacle thrown in the way. But it gave us more time to reflect and evolve. So I thought I would just really quickly at this point, Peggy, I will share my screen and put up a few slides so you don't have to just look at my talking head the whole time. Let's see here. Can you all see that?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. So the first question, you know, and it's pretty, I think we've covered some of it, but people still, they'll say, what are the rights of nature? And so this is just a definition that we put together, you know, pretty simple. It means securing the highest legal protections and the highest societal value for nature through the recognition of nature's rights and associated human rights. So again, it's not an either or, it's both together. We can't, like as Sister Carol said and Peggy mentioned, we can't separate this. Rights of nature is a new legal framework rooted in indigenous knowledge and also a new scientific understanding of our interconnectedness with nature. Again, what we've talked to, humans are part of nature, not above it. We're not here to manage it completely and, you know, oversee it. Rights of nature seeks responsibility and stewardship, not ownership. And that's part of the problem with our current legal system. In our legal system, property is seen as something to be owned. So it's invisible under the law as far as rights are concerned. Nature has a right to exist, flourish, and thrive in its own right, not dependent on human rights and on human economic gains. And so an example of this is like, we worked with some people in Florida and, you know, there's a bill, they were calling it right to clean water. And we've seen this in a lot of communities where they'll say, well, we have a right as the humans to clean water. That's true, but we have to then ask the next question. Does our right, why do you want the right to clean water? And if it's for economic reasons, does the lake or the river or whatever, will that activity help the lake and its ecosystem or the river and its ecosystem? So for example, in Florida, they wanted the right to clean water because they said dirty water is going to harm tourism and it's going to harm development going on, people wanting to buy homes down there and build homes down there. Well, that's fine for human economic gains, but those things, will that help the ecosystem and the other life within the waterways down there? So that's what we're kind of talking about. So when Sister Carol, you said about seeing it through the perspective of, you know, the river, that's what we kind of need to do. And it's something we haven't been taught to do. Rights of nature also gives legal standing to nature and provides residents living within the ecosystem and watershed with a legal tool to not only hold polluters accountable once they've done harm, but to object to the harm before it happens. which is also really important and not something we really have. We do have things like the regulatory system currently where people can go, you know, to a hearing and maybe voice their opinion that they think this project may harm the community, the ecosystem, whatever, but they don't have to do anything with your comments. There's no enforceability there. So we're talking about a movement, not just a moment, that our laws should be a reflection of our values. And so when those values change, our laws change. See, for a long time at CELDF, 25 years of this, we thought that if we had enough communities pass these laws, that would change culture, right? People's values would shift. And unfortunately, that didn't seem to be the case. Now we're kind of thinking, after we've had like this art project and got to reflect on some of this, that we maybe need a bigger, broader, you know, change in values of the society at large. And a lot of people, when you get things in court, in the legal system, they stop paying attention. They tune out for a couple of reasons. One, they think it's too complicated and I don't understand it. And two, they think, well, the lawyers will handle it now, right? I don't have to pay attention because it's there, it's in the courts. So that's why we've kind of are shifting a bit in our, you know, our I guess our activism, whatever you want to call it, and our strategies and our tactics. Change, we know, is born from confrontation. Social movements through history have been won over decades, not just one election, one initiative, one moment, but and Peggy, you mentioned that in your introduction, right? We a lot of times spend all this time on one chemical, on one project coming, and that's all great. I mean, I think that's good. We still need that resistance. I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing that, but we need more than that, because none of that is attacking the underlying system and structure that is actually causing these problems. And it can't just be about regulating harms and bad behavior, as we said. So like in Toledo, for example, they had a huge in Lake Erie algae bloom that shut their water down. And so this idea that, you know, if we just, the community or the system's answer was, we'll just add more chlorine to the water. We'll upgrade your water treatment plan and that'll fix it. We also can't just be worried about human economics, right? And our economic system. Not that economics isn't important, but it can't be the main number one all the time, the only thing we consider. In Cleveland, this was just obviously last month with the eclipse, but this was on a headline from the paper here, you know, talking about because the eclipse that it was going to be this great economic windfall for us here. I was like, oh boy. Good example of the economics being the number one front and center. And it can't just be about creating awareness. So again, some people mishear me sometimes, but I'm not saying awareness isn't important. It is important, but it has to be about more than that. Because here's this photo. This is from about 1960. And you can see, you know, what it's saying. Pollution's a shame, save Lake Erie. Nothing's really changed. People are still putting that up, but it's different issues. Back then it was the oil refineries and the petroleum and maybe the phosphorus. Today it's forever chemicals, PCBs, radioactivity in the water. So it's just that the harms and pollution's changed, but the system hasn't changed. And again, there's your Aldo Leopold quote, Peggy. So see, I really love his quote when he says, we abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. And when we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. And we have to look at this. This is a community too. So even though there's not a human in sight, that is still a community because there's a lot of life in that community. So is this. You might recognize that picture. The Hudson Valley. Yeah, sure, there's humans within that ecosystem, but there's a lot of other life too. So as Sister Carol mentioned, you know, we decided in a lot of this reflection that we needed something new. We needed something different. I don't know, it was like, this idea of, we worked so long on securing the highest legal protections for nature, but now we needed to focus more on that highest societal value that we talked about. And, we'd seen over the 25 years we've been doing the work, and we'd worked in lots of states, including New Hampshire, Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Pennsylvania, Florida, New Mexico, that the legal system, shut down rights of nature when we tried it in all these places because they saw it as such a threat. So, back to the idea that when the art museum contacted me and I said, what does art have to do with law? That maybe we needed to also think outside the box, right, on how policies and laws shift. And that this might entail the cultural shift, like I said, which is much broader. I mean, I feel sometimes like we're in a relationship crisis with our community and our neighbors, with elected officials, with other countries, and really, most importantly, with nature. So, as Sister Carol mentioned, we decided to do this truth reckoning and right relationship. And this was a big push, and I have to thank MoCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art Cleveland, and Andrea Bowers for her work. I mean, just to give you an idea, this is a huge neon she made. Lake Erie has the right to exist, flourish, and naturally evolve. And this is actually on the back facing Lake Erie of the Great Lakes Science Center. And it's been up for a while now, and it's going to stay up throughout the summer and the fall. And we're hoping it'll get to be a permanent sculpture within the city. But it's so interesting to watch people. This will become very crowded, this area in the summer, and to just see what people think, right? And the conversations that might start, like, what does that mean? This is one that's at the museum, and this is also staying up even after the exhibit closes May 26th. But this is a tribute to the Great Lakes Bill of Rights, and this is language from that bill. And this is huge. You can see the person on the right there, how small, so you can get it as to scale, the size of that. And the not to be owned, privatized, or monetized is lit up at night. And so you can see it through the museum. And this is a very busy place in the city as well. So, this idea of shifting and thinking like, well, how many people are going to see this and cause them to think differently? So that then maybe when the laws, right, get proposed or things, that they'll now have a connection to what that means. As Sister Carol mentioned, the first part was a truth and reckoning that she came to. And this idea that we have to be completely honest, which I'm not sure we've been with ourselves, right? And Sister Carol was very courageous to share her truths with everyone in the room. And there's recordings of these testimonies, the people who came, because they came from all areas of our culture. So we had a medical doctor there. We had academic. We had someone, you'll see that, I think the next one, yeah, this one, she worked for the EPA for over 20 years. And this is a quote from her testimony, and being completely honest that even though for 20 years of my career, I worked for the Environmental Protection Agency, I realize now, and I'm honest enough to say, it's not working. It's not preventing real environmental protection. And that takes guts, that takes courage to do. We had, like I said, a medical doctor there. He brought a different perspective. We had young people there. We had community members there. We had a journalist. And so it was this idea of starting from a place of truth and honesty instead of starting at a place where we do now, where we go, well, this is the system and what's the best we can get in it, right? What's the best? And we usually, so we're starting from a place of like trying to figure out ways to manipulate, and we can't because it's a fixed system. That's kind of what we've realized. I think the positive news, though, is again that the rights of nature movement has been growing steadily over the last 25 years. And even if as I mentioned at the beginning, just Peggy, you and Carol, what you said, this is moving quickly. And the good thing is we have a lot of technology and media things. Sometimes the media is not always great, but we do have the ability to share information more quickly. with people. And so I think that's causing, plus I think people are understanding what's going on with nature and our ecosystems and our environment. And we're seeing that there's this connection. So there's a lot of doctors, this Zach Bush, MD, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he made the connection, right? That it's interesting when we started this industrial agriculture, that it's the same time coincided with the explosion of chronic disease, ecosystem collapse, and biodiversity loss. And this is another doctor, an MD. She works in California at a hospital. And she wrote this book, Inflamed. And she's talking about, you know, connecting how as the world burns, you know, our inflammation in our body is, you know, things burn, not in order, not being, you know, working together. Something's not, you know, in jiving with each other. Something's causing this inflammation. And so it's interesting that, you know, she talks about that as we're shredding the relationships between organisms and places, that it's affecting our bodies as well. So all these things, you know, are really, I think, part of what we need to do. And talking to each other, that's what I want to also say to all of you. It's interesting because the system will tell us that we have to go to court. We have to have mass marches in the street. But what really threatened them the most in Ohio and the other places where we worked is when we joined together as community, trying to get these laws passed. That's what they want to stop. They don't like us talking to each other. And so they diminish when we try to do that, right? When we try to talk to our neighbors, when we try to have conversations, and when, especially when we focus on what we have in common, which is the need and desire for healthy, sustainable communities, for clean water, for clean air. They try to throw in this divide and conquer of other issues, right, to divide us. Not that we're not going to have, you know, different opinions on some of these issues, but if we start from a place of what we have in common, I think we can build relationship. That's the point of the right relationship. The event we had in April, it was 2 days. We brought people together again from all different walks of life, different places, but along the Great Lakes. And it was interesting, the relationships people formed even within the 2 days. And they want to stay in contact with each other. That is a threat. So again, you know, this idea, how can we build sustainable communities if we can't stop unsustainable activities, I think is important. And I want to throw out some questions, I guess, to you guys, and then see if we can have a little conversation about that. So does the law change culture, or do cultural shifts change the law? I mean, I'd like to get your perspectives on that. I'd also like to know, you know, if an ecosystem, I guess by you, maybe it could be water, maybe it could just be a forest, something else, but what is your relationship? And do you think you're in right relationship with that ecosystem? I mean, I'm curious if people will be honest and be open, I guess, about those things. And then another thing, maybe if we want to talk about, is what changes would need to happen culturally, legally, and economically to, you know, significantly and meaningfully protect, like the Hudson River Valley or nature, and allow them to flourish and thrive. So I'm curious what ideas all of you have on those questions and topics. So I'm going to stop sharing and open it up to all of you. You can either ask me a question, or if you want to, like, I think, open up and talk about one of those prompts or something else, I think that would be great.
So I just want to suggest you can either just raise your hand, or I suppose you could right now, you could just speak out, and you can put a question in the chat if you have a question. Anne, you have to unmute. Yeah.
Hi, Tish. I don't know if you remember, but in 2019, you presented for the Atlantic chapter of the Sierra Club at the Cornell Environmental Law Society via video about the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. And it was so exciting because it was before it got all squashed. So it was good to see your name, and I had to go back and where was she? And I found you in the program. So anyway, my question is how, because I have some friends and colleagues who have been, were, at least I think it's been kind of squashed as well, involved in the idea of the commons. And does this whole thing tie in with the commons, the idea of commons property, that there's property that's owned by everyone and not by any particular person, that's in particular nature? Have you come across that, or are you dealing with that idea at all? Or
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, there's some similar, things that I think are good about that. And then there's also some issues and problems with it as well. Because one, it's still viewing nature as property. And then the other thing is, and then the other thing, because that it ties into our current system, right? It's like always who gets to decide. So see, like with the rights of nature, the way we propose it is like people who live within that ecosystem should have the ability to bring, have standing to speak about the ecosystem because it affects them directly. So the problem with a lot of these commons and conservancies is they have a board, and sometimes again, it's people who don't even live there, right? So, I'm not going to say anything. It's not a generality like they're all bad or they're all good, but they do have issues and problems. And so we have to look closely at how everything is set up, right? And how it's going to
Yeah, that was the thought I had as I was framing that question in my mind. I'm going, but they're still seeing it as property. So thank you.
Yeah. I mean, even some of the conservancies that are set up that they have, and the problem is then we've seen them, they're leasing the property for drilling or whatever, because they go, oh, it'll help us raise money to then buy more land. Like, and this makes sense to some people. We're going to harm this land here so we can get revenue to then buy more land. And I'm like,
Yeah, that's a big problem with the conservancy. The Nature Conservancy in particular are notorious for that. So I guess I shouldn't have mentioned a name, but there it is.
Well, I mean, it's for people to look at. And again, I think everybody probably starts out with good intentions, right? And it's like, and then as you try to work within this system, you realize that, wait a minute, it's again, if you put a few people in charge to have the decision-making power, who has the authority, that's where we get into trouble a lot, I think.
Yeah.
Alan, you had your
Yeah, let me thank you first off. That it's wonderful work that you're doing, and I think it is a huge shift for a lot of people to even open their minds to this kind of thing. I've been part of what's called eco-psychology, and the eco-psychology movement has been trying to bridge people involved in mental health, psychotherapy, with the awareness that we're not separate from nature, that our mental health problems very often result from our alienation from nature, and that by being more connected to nature, you often can find it helps you with your anxiety or problems like depression. Have you explored at all I know you're interested in indigenous wisdom, as you said, that indigenous people use rituals and ceremonies in order to help people, even people who believe these kinds of ideas sometimes have a hard time actually experiencing it enough to move them to do what needs to be done. I know Lori, who's here, has been very involved with Joanna Macy, and her work is, very powerful in helping people to make that shift, not just to understand the ideas of things like nature having rights, but to experience nature as part of our living family.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and Sundance, who I mentioned, he does every month, he does a new moon ceremony. And so I go to that ceremony every month. And having read, obviously, pieces and talked to other indigenous people, we did have at the Truth and Reckoning, the Right Relationship, we had 2 women from the Walpole Island Nation, and they did a breakout session on ceremony. which was really interesting. And this idea, and for me, I started just by like, and you just show how colonized I am and propagandized into this way of thinking that we're separate from nature. And so it was just, I started by going out and like talking to the birds outside, and at first it felt so awkward, like I was like, oh my God, my neighbors are going to think I'm crazy, right? Like I'm out here talking to the birds, but it just gets easier. It's funny, the more you do it. And then every time I would go down to Lake Erie, I mean, I go to Lake Erie to feel better. Like when I'm feeling anxious and that I go, and she's just so awesome. And yeah, I started talking to her, and it's really interesting how just the more you do it, because we aren't taught to look at nature as a relative, as kin at all. But yeah, I do believe in that. And I think it's something we can all do. And I think the more we do it, just to tell you a quick story to show how separated even some young people are. I went and talked to a class because of the art show at Case Western Reserve University, and there was about 40 students in there. And I had them do some exercises like I just asked you with some of the questions and prompts about, and I used Lake Erie. I said, you guys are here by Lake Erie. I said, what's your connection to Lake Erie? And are you in good relationship? Well, one of the kids, and then they had to share, and one of the young men stood up and he said, I was born in this area, in this, Northeast Ohio. I've been raised here, and I have absolutely no relationship to Lake Erie. None. And I said, really? I go, you have no relationship at all? And he goes, nope. I don't never go to her, don't see her, don't, nothing. I go, I think you're mistaken. I said, I think you have a very intimate relationship with Lake Erie. And again, the class is like looking, and the teacher even was like, what? And I said, you do drink water, don't you? And he's like, yes. And I go, are you only drinking water from somewhere else, or you drink? He goes, no. I go, well, you were 60, 70% water. I go, Lake Erie's running through your veins. And you could just see the shift. Like,
Yeah,
and
that's
I thought,
beautiful.
wow. Yeah, they're not even making this connection, right? It's that idea. I remember being in elementary schools, and kids, they'd ask little kids, about milk. Where does milk come from? And they'd go from, Kroger's or Giant, the grocery store. And I'm thinking now it's with water. People young, and young and old, even the older people in the room, the professor didn't make that connection. So I'm like, we just think it comes from the faucet, right? Or out of that plastic bottle, or wherever you're drinking water from, that we're not connecting it to the source. So I think that's a real basic thing we can do to help people connect.
George, and then Lori, I'm wondering if maybe afterwards you want to say a few words also, because we were talking, Tish was talking about art, and I thought maybe that would be something that would resonate for you. George?
Tish, it's a wonderful presentation. Has something like what you proposed passed anywhere in the United States?
Yeah, they've passed. We've had lots of them passed, and some have not been challenged. So for example, we had the very first law in the world passed in the United States. It was Tamaqua Borough, Pennsylvania, small red community, southeastern Pennsylvania. That was passed in 2006, and it's never been challenged. So it's still on the books. That's the other problem with laws, right? Like if they're never put to use and never tried to be used, or anything, that also doesn't really help. But after what happened, that was passed in 2006, and most people don't even know that. Everybody points to Ecuador. Ecuador saw what happened in Tamaqua Borough, Pennsylvania 2 years later in 2008, and they were rewriting their constitution and asked CELDF to help draft the language to put into the Ecuadorian constitution. And now that law, because it's in their federal, national constitution, that's been used several times since 2008. And there's now cases finally coming out that they're ruling in favor of nature and stopping projects, mining projects and things. So on our website, if you're interested, we help translate, because they were obviously in Spanish. So we translated like the Los Cedros Cloud Forest case, and then there was 2 other cases, but we have the English translations on our website.
Great.
That's awesome. Lori, did you want to say anything? Or ask questions? You don't have
I
to.
really actually was feeling quiet, like maybe not to, for a change. But as you asked, what's coming to my mind, a couple things. I love the question of, which way does it go to create the legal framework, to change culture, or to change the culture, to influence the legal framework. I have worked here very closely with Peg for many years. I don't know, the 14 years, Peg. And, but I have danced around this circle from every direction, working directly on informing electeds and officials. Sometimes it works, sometimes it hasn't. I think influencing legislation is extremely effective to changing people when you can accomplish it. I just heard just an hour ago, I was listening to someone in a video. I don't know if he currently is, but it's the director of the Central Park Conservancy. It's a little related. And someone said, do people like clean up their own garbage in the park? And he said, well, I'll tell you, when we do a good job of cleaning up the park, they do a good job of cleaning up the park. And I find that with perspective and beliefs around our environment, people do follow laws more. And with art, I've been in the art world as a curator in New York City. I'm very influenced by the early years of the eco art movement. Really, I was part of it. But I always felt that stayed a little upper echelon-y. I'm not sure it reached all the people widespread, but it does trickle down a lot of the upper end art. But then just to share for anybody here who wonders about, like, I have taken that and worked with the next generation. I do programs now for kids. I gave up my art career and turned my work into creating art programs, environmental art programs for children, to put the earth in their hands and to have dialogue with them. Natural, kind of the way we all wish we had been raised up. We don't have native teachings to talk to the streams and the trees, but we do with our kids and our programs. And the art is like a gateway. I was telling it yesterday at the Maker Fair here. Art is like a gateway for them to open. And when people are open, there's more chance for learning or change. So I think art is very effective when it's community art.
I
think
agree
that's
with
a
you.
lot
Yeah.
of thoughts all at once, but thank you for asking, Peg.
Yeah, and I applaud you for doing, because I think that's true. The young people especially, they need to feel that connection, because again, it comes back to that wanting to protect it if you're connected to it. Like, how are you gonna fight for something if you're not even connected to it? That makes no sense. So no, I applaud. And I didn't mean I don't think there's any answer, right? Like, right
No,
or
I
wrong.
like the
think,
question is what I
yeah,
meant. I like, it is a
it's
good
both.
question to live
Right,
with.
it's both, but to get people to think about it, and I always think about the Martin Luther King when he wrote that letter from Birmingham jail, I believe that's what it was in, and he said, a law can keep you from killing me. It can't make you love me, but it can keep you from killing me, right? So it's like, it got to be both. But again, that idea that our laws should be reflections of our values as a society, and so right now our laws are basically, we can slowly destroy nature, right? Because we'll regulate the harm. We'll allow so many parts per million of this poison and so many parts per million of this poison. And so it's really what it is. And we don't see it that way, but it's a slow destruction of nature because at regulated amounts. And so we're now living with the consequences of 50 years of that kind of environmental law. So, yeah.
Susan?
I'm always struck, and goes with what you were saying. I'm always struck, even if you get a law passed, it gets over and over tested, and especially if it's an inconvenient law, it gets over and over tested. And the people who go for making this law, they wear out in the process. We had certain laws to protect the Kensico Reservoir, which 9 million people drink from, and yet and comes up and again and up and again, and George is working on that. Well, maybe we could just add this, or maybe we could just change this, or it's not going to affect this, or maybe we can build a little closer. And so you put a tremendous amount of effort into something, but you never really get a stable victory, let's put it that way. It's an ongoing effort.
Mhm. Two things. One, I always tell people, I go, and that's a great point, Susan, because it's always like this moving target, right? And it's like, so this idea that we're not going to like win and then you go home and everything's fine. I mean, you have to constantly stay engaged. And the other thing I always say is you have to remember the people with the power. That's why I think it's so important to know it's a power shift. And that's what's important, because the people who have the power to make the laws have the power to change the laws too, to their benefit. So right now, there's this, powerful, I would say, elite minority, which is what we had way back at the beginning of the founding of the country too, and even before that with the monarchies, right? And they're the ones who have the power to control and shift what the laws are. And so that's what we see. So every time activists win some small victory, those who have the power to change the laws from within, they usually do to their benefit, right? And so that's why we can't ever give up. It's a constant struggle. We have to constantly be vigilant and out there. I always sometimes think like maybe we should have like a mandatory, like for people's service that they do, right? To like community service, to be engaged in their community and protect it. But it's always that, again, that's why to me it's so important to change who gets to make the decisions in the community, and do the people have a way to override? Because currently we have people outside the community making decisions about your community and using it for their gain and benefit, whether it's as a resource colony or as a dumping ground for waste or whatever. But the people don't have any way really to have standing to get into court to say, no, wait a minute, this isn't right. So that's the part of the system that I'm the most bothered by, I guess. And the other thing is the idea that we also we're really good at creating illusions, I guess, in the law. And so part of this is this idea we're so protected by these regulations, right? That really don't, we let exemptions be written by the people who be benefit by those. They write the laws. We don't know who writes the laws. We think our legislators do, but they don't. And then the other thing is the jurisdictions we put up, right? Are false, like these false boundaries we put. And I even yesterday, I was talking to a relative of mine, and she's like, well, we have better protections here. And I'm like, well, that's not really true, because she lives in a foreign country, and she said, we have much stricter laws as far as, GMOs or like what pesticides can be sprayed and things. And I go, yeah, but that border that you think is created between you and that country next to you, if their regulations are not as good as yours, it's a little like delusional to think that the spray isn't coming across the border, that the GMO seeds aren't blowing across the border. But we believe that. We're really good at convincing ourselves of that.
And I think in the United States, we have a really deep sense of trust in our government. So we think that everything is safe because that's what the government is for. George, I know you had your hand up, and then Sister Carol.
Well, I just find this very encouraging and very nourishing, and I really appreciate it's making me think differently, even tactically. I know you mean it at a much deeper level, but it really helps, and it's already helping me with new ways to communicate. I think it's just wonderful, and I thank you.
Great, thank you. I hope it does. That's the whole point.
So can I just jump in a second here? So, and that is that I had heard a talk recently in which there was a young organizer talking about the rights of nature. And what he said is, when we look at like women's suffrage, for example, or the civil rights movement or something, you look at it after the fact and you think, okay, they came with this, we know they had to, we don't realize how long the movement was that led up to that. So you need to start putting that idea out there. It's a startling idea that trees and rivers should have legal rights. But if you don't start putting that idea out there and letting it people, discuss it and think about it, you can't get to the end result. You can't. So, okay, Sister Carol.
And I'm conscious you're gonna have your meeting soon. So I'm gonna just say something that maybe you can talk about either at the meeting or at your next meeting. So first of all, I want to say thank you for letting us join in this conversation because, and I think the other board members would agree with me, it really enriches us as ROAR members to have conversations with our environmental colleagues in this level, because we are inspired by you and your commitment, and you know so much more about the issues that you help teach us so that we can be advocates. So I really see it, this mutual relationship as really key. One of the things that we've been invited into as we're members is to be part of a coalition that Tish, thank goodness, is still helping us organize, because New York State Assemblyman Patrick Burke, it's in committee. There's a lot of advocacy that's going to need, but there is that New York State Great Lakes Bill of Rights that's in committee. So this is what I'd like to propose, because after reading Ruth's very moving in the chat box, Ruth, I can feel for you in terms of the trees and what you're being told, and Susan, what you were saying, because I know how you've been working with the water in Kensico Dam and trying, there's just so much for years and years. So my thought was, can we have a part 2 to this? And Tish, you who know a lot about the New York State Great Lakes Bill of Rights, how would that help if it were to be passed? How would that help, for instance, Ruth and the people that she's working with in terms of this existing tree law, and that they're trying to preserve these old growth trees? How would it help maybe think about the water and the expansion of the airport in Armonk? How would maybe even I know, again, I only know so little, Rockland County, I mean, I have just been impressed the way you have worked in terms of water and what you've done with the desalination, plant that, who knows, it might come up again, but you've done so much. How might some of the issues that our environmental colleagues in ROAR have been working on for such a long time, how might a New York State Great Lakes Bill of Rights help us and make it stronger for us as we work on these issues? So this is something that we're not going to answer now, but maybe we can do a part 2 where we have case studies from the very real situation that the environmental colleagues are working on, and then maybe you could share, Tish, saying if it were to come to pass. I don't know, it would have to be planned, but I'm just going to say, throw that out to the universe and see how that might, maybe come to be.
I mean, it's really interesting because New York, I mean, you guys are like, you have this great bill in the, that this legislator introduced. I mean, it's like this doesn't happen. I mean, this never happens where a legislator at the state level, because people at the local, we work a lot with local level community groups, and everybody will say a lot of times, they'll go, well, you're working at the wrong level, you need to go to the state level. So then when he wanted a Great Lakes Bill of Rights drafted, and it's so interesting because there isn't this great outpouring of support from people in New York because maybe they don't understand it, right? Like what we're talking about, it's a new concept. And so one, it would help immensely because a state passing it would be the first in the United States. And so that would get huge media attention. That alone would benefit, I think, local communities. But I can send around too, or I can have Peggy, she can send it to you, but the actual language that's in the Great Lakes Bill of Rights, because it has rights for the ecosystem, but it also has rights to a clean and healthy environment. And it says the people and the natural environment, including each ecosystem of the state of New York, shall possess the right to a clean and healthy environment, which includes the right to a clean and healthy Great Lakes. So, you know, it has other things in it, you know, right to be freedom of from toxic trespass. And that again talks about the people of the state of New York, as well as the Great Lakes ecosystem and watersheds. So even though it's written specifically as the Great Lakes Bill of Rights, we put language in that it would be broader than that on purpose. So anyway, so either way, I mean, it would just be huge to get the media attention, I think, and to use it as an educational tool, which is what we've been trying to do. But a lot of people aren't aware of it. And there's even environmental groups that are very resistant to it. So
I want to suggest, you know, now we're up to the last, I don't know what it is, like 2 weeks of the session, the legislative session in New York State. I think if I'm understanding correctly, it would need to be reintroduced next year. But maybe we can use that time until the next session, which isn't until January, from June 6th until January, whatever it is, to kind of, you know, meet with legislators, talk to them about it, kind of bring up what's beneficial, you know, kind of this is the time to maybe have more a follow-up conversation, as Sister Carol is suggesting, and then to try to organize a little bit around it about why it's so important. Does that make sense to people?
And I would say too, we have no illusion, right, that this is just going to get past it. I mean, it's right. It's not. I mean, that's not. And even if it goes through committee, it's going to get like totally reshaped, and it's going to not be what we wanted originally. But to use it as an educational tool, because even talking to people about it, people can't envision something unless you have it in hand, right? So this is also to provide an example for people of what this is what a law like this could look like.
Susan and then Anne.
I'll pass.
Okay.
No.
Anne? You sure?
Yeah, Peggy. You should, well, we should talk. You should use the water issues listserv as a forum for putting anything and everything that you do on it. I think you should be another co-chair, actually. So, I mean, it wouldn't be anything other than having that, you know, that status, so people would listen to what you're saying maybe more and getting this out there. So that's all.
Well, we should talk separately about that. I also just want to raise the issue of the sense of awe. You know, I think that's kind of like, you know, part and parcel of what Sister Carol was trying to get across, and certainly what I feel is that sense of connection with the natural world very often is, you have to have, as Aldo Leopold said, I think in the quote that somebody put up, some of those quotes were wonderful, Tish. I particularly love the one from the woman who had worked at the EPA. That was the one that I could really relate to, as somebody who has worked for a long time on different kinds of battles, mostly on the water side. But if you can share your PowerPoint, that would be great. I'd love those quotes. But also the sense, you know, you can't care about something, you can't understand it and respect its need to thrive unless you love it. And I feel very often for the natural world that sense of connection with everything really is deeply rooted in a sense of awe. I don't know if other people relate to that, but it's just, I know, you know, Rachel Carson wrote about the sense of wonder, you know, just, you know, there's a spiritual side to this too. I'm trying to say, not just a legal side to it. I think it's both, you know.
I agree with you.
So,
and there's also, Peggy, I saw you put in chat a lot of the links I had sent you. And so you can watch some of those testimonies. I mean, Sister Carol's is very moving. Hers is on there. We broke them out separate, so you can pick and choose which ones you want to listen to. Andrea also made a documentary as part of her art exhibit, and the documentary film is titled "What We Do to Nature, We Do to Ourselves." So there's a trailer in that link too for that. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great resources and things. I agree with you, Peggy, that's got to be that emotional connection, because that's what will allow us to take risks, right? I mean, that's why people during the suffrage movement, you know, the civil rights movement, the abolition movement, all those things, it was because they felt so deeply and had a connection, and they were willing to take risks. And I hate to say, I mean, you know, it's like, it's nice to educate and talk about all this stuff, but it's going to come down to, yeah, we're going to have to take risks. I mean, whether it's financial risks or whether it's, you know, bodily risks or whatever, because it's again about a power shift, and it's not going to come easily. They're not just going to one day wake up and go, oh yeah, you're right, we should be doing this. No, but I think we have a lot of power in numbers, right? The people, as we all start believing, like you're talking about the awesomeness, and that we believe deeply in what is right and what's a spiritual connection we have, that's what'll save it, I think, and save all of us in the process.
Well, so maybe we should wrap up and let everybody go. Were there any other last comments or questions? Anything that I missed from the chat in terms of questions? Let's see. Okay, I apologize if I did miss it, but thank you so much, Tish and Sister Carol, for bringing this to our attention. I just want to mention that I'm going to stay on for anybody who wants to hear. I'll just talk quickly about some of the state legislation, and also about Rockland's water issues. Or we just wrapped up a case. We didn't wrap it up. A case just wrapped up for the Public Service Commission case on the Suez-Veolia water issues. So, Anne, if you want to hear a little bit of that, you might want to stay on for a few minutes. And any of the Rockland people who want to hear how what came out of that, maybe stay on
Yeah,
for a few minutes.
some 2017 water law. That was in the 20, so it's cool.
I just want to say thank you very much, Roar, as those of us from Roar, we really thank you very, very much for doing this, and hopefully we'll continue the discussion. I might listen. I'm going to turn off my camera because I also had meetings last night, and I'm going to stand and do some exercises, I think. Okay.
Yeah, and I want to thank you, Peggy, too, and you too, Carol. And yeah, anybody, if you have questions, feel free to email me. It's tish@celdf.org. Happy to answer questions.
Yeah, and Tish and Sister Carol, maybe we can reconnect and kind of figure out next steps. Where do we go?
Sounds great.
Yeah. Thank you so much for everything.
Good night.
Yeah. So I just want to quickly mention, first of all, some of the legislation that we've been following. New York Heat Act and Climate Superfund Act has